I think this is a bold initiative. I would describe it as an incursion. I do not believe that they're going to be there all that long. I think it's one thing to get across the frontier, do a war of maneuver, keep moving. As soon as it settles into more of a stalemate, they face having to defend a front line in Russia. My own feeling is they'll then pull back. They will have shown Putin that his rear areas behind the front line are very vulnerable. They will have made the Russian general staff pull back forces from Ukraine. They can always do another incursion elsewhere. So my feeling is that this is a perfectly justifiable tactical maneuver to grab the initiative and destabilize the adversary.
Ukraine wants permission to fire British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles against targets inside Russia to help them cut off Russia's supply lines. Since launching their offensive 10 days ago, the Ukrainian army says it's captured over 1,000 square kilometres of Russian territory, but it is now being slowed down as Moscow deploys reinforcements. Let's speak to Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, former National Security Advisor and Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office. Lord Ricketts, good morning.
Good morning.
Very good to speak to you. In terms of this request from Ukraine, from an officer speaking to the Times, suggesting that Britain should let Ukraine use Storm Shadow cruise missiles against targets inside Russia, should we?
Well, we have allowed them to use a lot of the other weapons we've supplied. We've seen reports that Ukraine is using the Challenger tanks we've supplied. That seems to be entirely justified. They're acting in self-defense after being invaded. The Storm Shadow missile is probably the most capable weapon that we've supplied to them. It's very long range. And I guess there are concerns in Whitehall that that could lead them to attack targets very far from the front line, from Ukraine, then with wider consequences. So I can understand why that's causing more questions in Whitehall. But in principle, I think we should be willing to supply weapons to Ukraine, trust their judgment, to use them within the rules of law, respecting the need to protect against civilian casualties, a proportional way. And so by and large, I'm in favor of allowing them to use the weapons, using their judgment, knowing that they won't do so recklessly.
How concerned are you about this incursion, invasion by Ukraine of Russian territory? First of all, what should we call it? And to what extent should we support it? When should we say this has gone too far?
Well, I'm not at all concerned about it. If you look at the context, they've had 2.5 years where Russia has felt it's fine to attack the whole of Ukraine territory with missiles and drones, to occupy a big chunk of territory in the east. The Ukrainians in the last year or so have been facing a grinding Russian offensive, gradually kilometer by kilometer, making ground against them. The risk was that the narrative would settle in that Ukraine was gradually losing this war. They had to do something to break out of that. I think this is a bold initiative. I would describe it as an incursion. I do not believe that they're going to be there all that long. I think it's one thing to get across the frontier, do a war of maneuver, keep moving. As soon as it settles into more of a stalemate, they face having to defend a front line in Russia. My own feeling is they'll then pull back. They will have shown Putin that his rear areas behind the front line are very vulnerable. They will have made the Russian general staff pull back forces from Ukraine. They can always do another incursion elsewhere. So my feeling is that this is a perfectly justifiable tactical maneuver to grab the initiative and destabilize the adversary. I don't see it as an invasion that is intended to occupy Russian territory for all time. No.
There had been warnings from Russian officials previously that if Western weapons were used on Russian territory, that would be considered a grave escalation. Should we be concerned about that?
Well, the Russians are past masters at this kind of flesh creeping. No, I don't honestly think we should. I think the Russians very well know the power of NATO. They know we're supporting, a friend and an ally of NATO. I don't think they're going to come after individual NATO countries. They also keep threatening to do even worse things in Ukraine. But frankly, I think they're throwing pretty well everything they've got at Ukraine. And the Ukrainians will have judged that this maneuver, this incursion, is something that will unsettle the Russians, and they're prepared to accept the risks of further Russian drone attacks and whatever else they might have in store. I don't think we should see this as a problem for us. I think it's a way of supporting our brave ally who has been fighting, in the cause we believe in, the right to choose your own form of government for the last 2.5 years.
It does once again, though, doesn't it, sort of question the inverted commas rules of war and And the fact that Ukraine is an ally and NATO is backing Ukraine, even to the point of incursions onto Russian and into Russian territory, yet we can't seem to do enough to tip them over the balance into actual all-out victory. Why not? Why, if we're so supportive to this extent, can't we find a way to bring this thing to an end and for Ukraine to win?
Well, they are facing, of course, a very powerful military nation that is prepared to conscript soldiers, throw them into the front line, have thousands and thousands killed, have very deep stocks of rather old weaponry that they're repurposing. The Western armaments industry simply isn't capable of producing enough ammunition, artillery shells, weapons to give Ukraine the real edge that they need. And yes, we do expect Ukraine to fight within the rules of law. The Russians certainly don't do that. They attack civilian targets. They show absolutely no sense of responsibility. We need our ally to do that. So they are fighting, to a different set of rules from Russia, but I think that's reasonable given that they have aspirations to join NATO.
Yeah.
I don't think we can make the final difference, but we can give them every support in the long campaign that they are pursuing.
Lord Ricketts, thank you very much indeed. Lord Ricketts is a former National Security Advisor.